So this is now part 3 of the lecture, and I want to address why is language revitalization so important? Why is it important that we take the large amount of time and effort that it takes to record, to understand, to teach, to learn, to speak native languages that are endangered? I'd like to offer a few thoughts. I think it's very important. I may be a bit biased on this point as a linguistic anthropologist who works, among other things, on topics of indigenous language, but I do think it's very important, and I'd like to make some arguments for why, some of which will actually be quotes from your readings. By the way, I want to apologize for my scratchy voice. I'm quite sick at the moment. So, first is a quote from Claire Swan, Denina Elder, who has been a prominent leader in Cook Inlet, Regional Corporation, and Cook Inlet Tribal Councils, and among Kanaitsi Indian tribe, just very prominent leader who we're all very grateful and thankful for. She was actually just at KPC giving some remarks related to our commencement. But Claire Swan says, when they took away our language, they took away our ability to think in our own way. I'd like to repeat that. When they took away our language, they took away our ability to think in our own way. So thinking about language as not just a sort of one-to-one, where one language perfectly encapsulates the thoughts being conveyed in another language, right? We sometimes have that impression. It's the dream of the Star Trek Universal Navigator, the idea that we can sort of translate easily across languages. But of course, languages arise out of a specific cultural context that they grew up within, and a lot of times they do have the exact same words in different language, just different ways. Sometimes they are just different ways of saying the same thing, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes there are unique concepts found in one language and not another, or you have to say it in roundabout or imprecise ways in another language. Or, perhaps more significantly, the grammar and underlying structures are different enough that it feels like, as Claire Swan is saying, that you are losing a way of thinking by being forced into a different language. And so that is something worth knowing and worth thinking about. And indeed, there's evidence to suggest that cognitively there are very positive cognitive effects to knowing more than one language. It doesn't necessarily have to be an indigenous language, but it's worth pointing out that pushing people towards a language homogeneity, a language monoculture of a single language, is not doing people favors, that it is cognitively beneficial for people to speak more than one language. Joel Isaac says, language is a response to place. It's the form of communication. So this is why we have to do the language with the culture. They're not separate, right? Indeed, they're interconnected. Not only is it the case that culture would be impossible with language, we would not be able to share thoughts and ideas fully without language, but it is also the case conversely that language would be impossible without culture, that language is fundamentally inflected with culture, and that when we take it upon ourselves to learn a language and to document a language, we are partly taking it upon ourselves to drink deeply from the well of that specific culture. As was mentioned in an earlier lecture by Dr. Boris, the ways in which, for example, animacy is attributed in the verb structure to human beings, but also to dogs, but also to Orthodox crucifixes and Orthodox icons, shows a certain sort of view of spirits, of sentience, of animacy, and one that's reflected in the language. So when we go to learn about a language, we're again drinking deeply from the well of that culture, as a whole lot of great linguistic and linguistic anthropology and indigenous studies literature tells us, right? We learn great insights from delving into the particularities of the language. And so the more work we can do into understanding it, the better we can do that. Dr. Hune Lance Twitchell, who's a fantastic public speaker, strongly recommend listening to his remarks. He puts essentially all of his teaching materials up on YouTube, which I think is incredible. He says, he's an expert on Tlingit, among other languages, and he says, our language is everything. It's the air we breathe. It's the blood that flows through our veins. I don't think I can improve at all upon that statement or really add anything to it. I just think it's very powerful that a language is a lot more than solely a way of transmitting basic ideas. I'll share now from the NPS, the Park Service reading that you did. When a language disappears, a way of viewing and thinking about the world goes with it. That's a complex point and not one that all people would agree with. And I would say it's not necessarily the case that a worldview is entirely lost when its associated language is gone. I think that that's not entirely true, but I do think that there are nuances of meaning that we lose with a worldview when we lose a language, and we lose the most readily adapted and best adapted means of expressing that worldview. So I don't know that the worldview is lost necessarily, but I definitely think a worldview shifts as a result of language loss, and that can be a very tragic thing when we lose alternate visions of the world. I think that's one of the great values of studying different cultures, is having many different ways of approaching our common human condition and our various multitudinous challenges. They go on. Poetry, puns, lullabies, and endearments are gone forever. The collective history, culture, and values of the Dena'ina people are embedded in the sounds, words, and grammatical structures of the Dena'ina language. I want to repeat that. The history, culture, and values are embedded in the sounds, words, and grammatical structures. So it's worth it to get deep inside the very complicated verb conjugations and prefixes and suffixes. It's worth it to get inside how the different nouns work and why the nouns work they do. As a very simple example, it's fascinating to see the way in which many animal names directly reflect either behavior, markings, or sounds of the animal, such as the word for raven, gloini, which indeed sounds a lot like how a raven sounds, although many people don't realize that unless they've spent a lot of time around ravens, that ravens can make that noise and do make that noise. It's a sign of a culture that has grown up around raven and paid attention to raven. So, indeed, culture is embedded in a variety of ways, some of them subtle, some of them seemingly small, some of them very large. They say English may function equally well as a system of communication, but it lacks the long-standing connection with the Dena'ina people. Which raises another very important point, which is the sense of identity, right? I think one of the strongest cases that can be made for why language revitalization is so important is that it contributes to a people's sense of identity, a distinctive cultural identity, and that can be a very powerful thing in a world where we seek and need connection. We seek and need community. I think having a language that identifies us with our community, with our place, with our roots, can be a very powerful thing. So, I return again then to the concept of a peoplehood matrix from Holm and Pearson and Chavis's paper a number of years ago, an Indigenous Studies paper, but they talk about 4 essential elements of Indigenous peoplehood, Indigenous sort of identity as peoples, as specific peoples, right? What makes Navajo people or Dene people Dene and not Hopi, right? What is it that gives you a distinct identity flavor as a people, as a culture? And they talk about language, and they talk about religion. They also sometimes phrase that sacred ceremonies, which might feel more comfortable for folks that this has a strong association of organized religion, land, and then a history. I put, in parentheses, a sacred history, because very often it's not just an oral history, but an oral history with sacred elements to it. So language is an important part, and indeed language allows for these other things. Oftentimes the stories can best be described or may only be described in a certain kind of language. Connections to the land are embedded in place names, and religious teachings are often embedded in language, and vice versa. So what does it matter then if we lose languages? I think it matters a great deal. To talk about a few of the things that have just been touched upon in those quotes and in that model, and then to perhaps add a couple of my own thoughts. First, language connects us to our ancestors. There's a great book that I strongly recommend, Keith Basso's classic ethnography, Wisdom Sits in Places, Language and Landscape Among the Western Apache. He describes the difficulties in describing a place name when he was working on a project to describe the indigenous place names of Western Apache people. He was speaking to an elder. He struggled with repeating the pronunciation of a place name he was being taught. And he said, it doesn't matter, it's in the recorder, it's okay. Because, he could tell the elder was struggling because the elder was missing most of his teeth, and so it was hard for him to pronounce it in a way that Keith Basso, who only partially understood the language, could understand. And so he said, it doesn't matter, it's okay, we've got it in the recorder, I'll learn it, I'll get it down later. And then the elder says, it does matter. What you're doing isn't respectful. What he's doing isn't respectful. This is the speech of our ancestors, right? So when we're taking up a language of our ancestors, in a very real sense, we are connecting sonically, sound, with ancestors, at least in many indigenous worldviews. And that's not an insignificant thing in a world where we seek and desire connection. Language connects us to landscape. It gives us place names to help us better understand our land. Oftentimes those place names are uniquely descriptive of that space in a way that modern English place names, very often named after the names of people, may or may not be very descriptive. For example, naming a mountain Mount McKinley is not terribly descriptive of it, right? It is simply attaching a Westerner's name to the mountain. One of the reasons we've switched over to Mount Denali. Language contains cultural teachings, both simple and profound. I mentioned before the example of animacy. Another example would be the ways in which Athabascan languages in general, Dena'ina included, complexly convey different kinds of movement and temporality, the different ways in which things move and their patterns in movement, and the way in which they are at rest or in motion. It's very subtle, arguably a lot more complex in the way that language, or that those concepts are encoded than English typically is, or a lot of other European language, and that, I think, says something about cultural teachings among Athabascan cultures as far as life, animacy, and movement. A lot of other things are encoded in the language as well. I'm certain that we would say similarly about Shukpiak. I'm simply not familiar with the language, but I'm certain that that is the case. Yupik, which I have at least slight familiarity with, I can certainly say that this is the case. The fact that Yupik uses evidential markers sometimes in verbs to say that, I heard such and such about a piece of information tells us a great deal about the way in which traditionally Yupik culture dealt with truth claims and the idea of truth that you've seen versus truth that you've just heard about, hearsay, or it is said. So language contains cultural teachings. It conveys stories. Languages are often the best vehicle for traditional stories. It doesn't mean that we cannot tell those stories in other languages like English, although there are indigenous languages like Zuni where you are supposed to tell the story in its original language in certain contexts. But certainly languages give a power and profundity to those sacred stories and those historic stories. Languages promote identity. As I said before, they help us to feel connected as a group of people, as a distinctive group of people. And I think when we think about that peoplehood matrix, right, especially as groups of people have other kinds of stressors put upon them, I think language becomes all the more important as a way of asserting a cohesive identity. For example, as people lose access to some of their land base, I think one could argue that language becomes ever more important in establishing identity. And I don't think that means that every single person has to be fluent for that identity being maintained, but I think there's a power even in the use of some words in a collective setting of asserting a shared identity. And finally, language is tied to a variety of other factors. One of those factors might be physical health. A variety of people in a variety of different scholarly contexts and papers have argued that language use is beneficial for health, that indigenous language revitalization or use is beneficial for health. That's a topic that's been qualitatively written about for a very long time. More recently, it's received some quantitative research on some sort of Western scientific type approach with but particularly of sort of the empiricist causal variety. And so, for example, it was found that in certain studies that were produced over the last 10 years, this is, by the way, from this article, so I'm not citing the original research studies, but instead the research studies summarized in this article from Miami University. They say that for indigenous groups in British Columbia, in which 50% of the community is conversationally fluent, that doesn't mean knows the entire language, but conversational, the youth suicide rate was 1/6 that of less fluent bands. The language factor was consistent even when other cultural factors were subtracted from the analysis, right? So when I initially saw that, my initial reaction was, well, I mean, this kind of makes sense in the sense that a community where over 50% of the people are conversational is probably a community that also has a lot of other things going in terms of sort of cultural well-being, traditional modes of education, a strong educational system. There's probably a lot of probably a decent amount of funding if they're able to do language programs. There's probably a strong sense of cultural community that hasn't been as sharply detracted from. So I was thinking, there's a lot of other factors, right? So it's tough to say causation or correlation there. But it is significant that for that specific study, they looked at a lot of other cultural things and still found that the language use had a strong effect, or at least some effect on suicide rates, pretty profound effect. I think that is notable. And it speaks, among other things, to the identity factor of speaking native languages and having a sense of that identity through that. It says the percentage of smokers in U.S. southwestern tribes where indigenous languages are widely known was 14% compared to 50% among northern plain tribes where language use is sparse. That is, I think, a really tough one. I don't find that data quite as significant because it's comparing two really different ethnographic contexts. Among other things, U.S. southwestern tribes have well, I shouldn't speak in generalization, but some of the southwestern tribes have access to a much larger amount of their original lands. For some, that's not the case, but for some it is, whereas northern plain tribes pretty much overwhelmingly had the vast majority of their lands taken. And to the extent that substance use is sometimes related to sort of systemic poverty and colonialism issues, I don't know how much we can compare those, but it is an interesting observation. Canadian First Nation groups with greater cultural retention as indexed by language use had significantly lower rates of diabetes after factoring out socioeconomic factors. That to me is very compelling. And in Australia, those who spoke their heritage language of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander were found to have half the rate of poor health, quote unquote, as those who had switched to English. So this doesn't mean it's an open and shut case, but I think we have some really compelling studies that have been done, really compelling, to show connections between physical health, to at least suggest connections between physical health and language use in indigenous communities. And I think that that's something really worth noting as we think about the importance of language use. Finally, I want to return us to the concept of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which I talked about in a previous lecture. Alan Boris talked about it in a previous lecture. But I want to quote Edward Sapir, one of the people that helped develop the ideas that eventually we came to call the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir never called it that to my knowledge, but he says, no two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same social reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. A pretty profound statement, right? Distinct concepts found in one language and not another. So, for example, to translate the Dena'ina term Nakaltani as God is not incorrect, and indeed that's often a way that God is translated into Dena'ina by a Christian Dena'ina, if they're choosing to speak in Dena'ina. But Nakaltani also refers to a lot of other concepts as well, in terms of sort of essence, animacy, universe, among other things. So things which do overlap with concepts of God, but also sort of have its own subtle nuances of meaning. So different worlds, right, produce not just different labels, but also different permutations of concepts. So the idea of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which developed out of the ideas of Edward Sapir and his mentee, this dapper gentleman, Benjamin Whorf, is that idea that language not only transmits our ideas, but in fact shapes the ideas, and more particularly as Whorf developed the idea that the habitual grammar of a language, the basic way in which it structures things that you end up having to use over and over and over again if you're going to speak in that language, lends itself to certain thought patterns. He looked at that in terms of Hopi ideas about time in relation to the way in which Hopi time is marked in Hopi language when you want to talk about actions occurring in the future, past, or present, and noted pretty significant differences in how that's linguistically done, and argued that that led to a more cyclical view of time. Some people have taken some issues with that concept in terms of the particularities of Hopi language, but I think the overall idea of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is not invalid. And if you want to hear me go on at length about that, you can take my linguistic anthropology class, but we do have a lot of examples of that. So I've made a list here. I'm not going to go into all of them, but as one example, among Cook-Theora people in Australia, they've done cognitive science tests that suggest that the fact that Cook-Theora people, so when you greet somebody, you say, where are you going? And people identify themselves very precisely according to what direction they are, like compass direction, like north, west, etc. And so and also even like when you're talking about your body, you talk about your north and south arm or your east and west arm, not your left and right arm. It's a very different way of orienting oneself. And lo and behold, that seems to carry over into how people think in a variety of ways, including that if you ask them to order pictures that show a person growing up, presumably an English speaker typically would do that left to right, youngest to oldest, left to right, just like you read. For Kuktheor people, they do it east to west in accordance with direction. So whichever way you're pointing, it might be left, it might not be, it might be right, but from east to west. Another example was Hopi time. Another example was gas drums. So Worf made note as a previous insurance claims investigator that people oftentimes saw signs for empty gas drums and assumed that they were safe because it's empty, right? Empty in English means devoid of content. But indeed, empty in this case means it's devoid of the oil liquid, but it sure has the oil fumes, oftentimes vapor, and so lighting a cigarette around one is not a smart thing to do and can lead to all sorts of disaster. So it's the way in which we structure the word empty grammatically leads to a misunderstanding and a misperception, right? It shapes thinking. There was a study done back in the 50s by a scientist by the name of Carroll on Navajo-speaking versus English-speaking Navajo children, and basically found that people, the Navajo kids that spoke English primarily tended to group objects by color, and Navajo kids that spoke Navajo primarily tended to group by shape, which makes sense because in Navajo, your grammar requires you, when you're saying something like pass that object from across the table, to clarify the shape of the object. So we have pretty good subtle examples of the ways in which, our thinking about the physical world is affected by the grammar that we use, at least some of the times. Something that's more speculative, but I personally think is compelling, I think a compelling case can be made, is that the ways in which we use words for bigger, kind of more abstract notions also affects our thinking. As a good example, when we talk about natural resources or even use grammar that reflects that, grammars of use of sustainable harvest, right? This idea of something that is taken at a certain rate, that's sort of grammatically coded into how we speak about animals and plants sometimes. I think it does kind of reinforce, I don't think it entirely creates, but it does help reinforce a certain kind of view of how we sometimes view the environment. So Sapir-Whorf hypothesis then would suggest, if we were to accept it, I'm not saying we have to, but if we were to accept it, that certain ways of language can help shape certain kinds of thinking. And certainly that's the experience of some people when they get to know a language and start learning a new language, that they start to think a little differently. So I think that's a power in keeping indigenous languages alive. I've mentioned this before, I think, but Alan has a great, this is a place names map that Alan did, as you can see, in collaboration with a lot of different Dena'ina elders and others, showing different Dena'ina place names. So for example here, Katikatnu, Big Open River for the Cook Inlet, Katnu, Kenai River. Anyways, these place names are a powerful thing, partly because, as those two examples suggest, or as this example suggests, when people gather, place like Kishafena. Let's take another one. Yaganindikeli, good land mountains. So the mountains of the Kenai Peninsula. Duzdobana, Peninsula, Duzdobana, Peninsula Island Lake, right? A lot of these names, as you can tell, have physical descriptors in them. Alan talks about in one of his lectures, almost freezing to death because he got lost while snowshoe hiking in the middle of winter. Couldn't find his car. Found a place called Nibana, which is describes a certain place as basically being an island in a lake. He was able to find the frozen lake with an island in the middle. He says, Nibana. That let him know the overall location compared to other Dena'ina place names. He was able to get himself unlost and unfrozen, which is a good thing. So place names can also structure how we think about places and be a powerful thing as well. So some take-homes that I want to make about language as a whole now It's not a simple thing to work on revitalizing a language. It's not a simple thing why a language declines in the first place. There's a lot of factors, some a lot more powerful than others, but there's a lot of factors. So it's not a simple thing. It's also not a simple thing because the languages themselves are complex. But that is partly why they are so important to preserve, to document, to learn, because it is precisely in that complexity that different worlds are opened up to us. I put here experts can be very helpful. We're grateful for the work of people. I'm putting experts here in quotes because I mean two kinds of different experts. I do mean experts like people that are trained in the science of linguistics. We're very grateful for people like Jim Carrey, for example, like Alan Boris, like many, many other people that have worked, both indigenous and non-indigenous linguists. But we are also grateful for experts that are simply experts because they speak their own language and are passionate about it. Nothing beats language community mentoring each other, right? One of the best possible things we can do is just get more people speaking, because the best possible way to learn language is by immersion in it, as we all know. And trying other methods, right? And so storybooks, as we talked about in this module, audio recordings online, college classes, not one approach I don't think is best. Instead, I think it is very wise that we try many, many different approaches that will work for different people to the extent possible, because language revitalization is important and it's worth our efforts. So, Chinan, thank you.